everyone. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join what is the early evening for us, but is the morning for our distinguished guest. So we're really delighted to have Cyriel Pennartz with us here today to join for one of our TRALF discussions. Cyriel is a man who's very, very difficult to introduce because he's done so much interesting and just fantastic work across a really big, diverse array of fields. Um, I think the thing that has really stood out to me, though, watching Cyriel, is just the way that he's been able to corral just a really lovely group of scientists around him to join him on this shared vision of trying to understand something as enigmatic as consciousness, but with a real commitment to scientific clarity across multiple different domains. And so being able to watch his group develop, it's a group that we really look up to and admire, and we're really excited to hear about the construction of that group, the kinds of questions they ask, the kinds of things that Cyril's interested in understanding from the vantage point that he has. So thank you so much for joining us today, Cyriel. Well, I'm lovely to have you.
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah.
Excellent. So maybe if we could just get started, you could just tell us a little bit about, who you are, what you're interested in doing, how you see yourself in your role at the University of Amsterdam.
Yeah. How I started, yeah. I think that when I was young already, was captivated by an interest in mind and brain, but by an entry through philosophy. That was through Spinoza, I think, this Dutch, Portuguese, Jewish philosopher who lived in Amsterdam, but that was more of a happy coincidence. Um, and I don't think I understood like his book Ethics very much at the time. But still, you can get captivated by it by certain sentences and phrases and ideas of thinking, and that led, I think, me to an overall interest in the topic. So when I started studying biology, first in Nijmegen, the question was sort of which direction do you choose there? One direction was obviously genes, genetics, cancer, so more the molecular branch, and the other one was mind and brain, and that seemed still more interesting to me. Um, Maybe also because of the general topic of mind and brain, and consciousness in particular. But at that time, there weren't so many possibilities to combine that topic with like pure neuroscience. So neuroscience at the day was indeed very much driven by molecular biology, cell biology. So let's say the somewhat lower aggregate levels of the brain, synaptic function, and so on, which was fine. But yeah, the field of, let's say, cognitive science, computational neuroscience, wasn't going very much yet. It was just the time of David Marr and let's say the initial steps into computational neuroscience. But then along my studies became medical biology, neurobiology. This got into the field. So this was early 80s basically when John Hopfield came out with his model, and we got more neural network models. So that caught my interest. To eventually do a PhD on basically reinforcement learning. That's how we would call it now. But in practical neurophysiology, that was actually studying, brain slices with the nucleus accumbens, striatum, prefrontal cortex, and that gave a really good entry into the models of reinforcement learning, which had been around, the models of Bartow and Sutton, for a little while, but there was a lot to do. And then later on, that sort of expanded into more research on perception, connecting memory systems to perception, motivation. So for me, the big picture is really to integrate all those brain functions.
Yeah, so even in just that really brief overview, it's striking to me that you have sort of taken on all these completely different aspects of the topic. You sort of start in philosophy, drift into biology, then move into kind of computational modeling, and then kind of this big sort of swirling soup of all of them. So I'm really curious, how that kind of came about. Were you constantly on the lookout for different types of explanations, or was it just that you were exposed to different things? Did you have just mentors at the time that, were working on that stuff? And like, oh wow, or was it more a kind of frustration internally that you weren't seeing the kinds of answers you were looking for?
Yeah, I think the latter played a role, because if you poke around in brain slices all day with glass electrodes, that's already frustrating. You're trying to find a cell and impale the membrane and get a good recording. Um, but of course, a brain slice, yeah, is an isolated in vitro preparation, so there won't be very much cognition to discover, except perhaps for synaptic plasticity and how dopamine works on the cells. So yeah, I started looking for the bigger picture, which held in vivo the interest in vivo work. Like how do these cells function in the living brain, a brain that actually executes tasks and processes reward and so on. Um, and then modeling it, yeah, which was new at the time. So back then, um, like this nucleus accumbens, this ventral striatal structure, um, was beginning to be implicated in drug addiction. It was work by Floyd Bloom and Trevor Robbins, Barry Everett, and we talked to them. But at the time, there was an idea that sort of these structures are one node. I mean, the whole nucleus accumbens would be one node, and it would have sort of one role, and act as a monolithic unit. Whereas, already the Hopfield model and the upcoming neural network model said, well, we need to view this as a parallel distributed processing system. So not all the cells will do the same, and you can't treat them as a mass, basically. So we introduced that notion, and then by contacts with anatomists, and indeed my mentor was originally a psychiatrist, Lopez da Silva, um, got into the notion of ensembles, and that kicked on a whole series of research, to indeed buttress that, yeah, such structures also function as collections of ensembles rather than monolithic units. By now that almost seems trivial perhaps, but at the time, yeah, neuropharmacology functioned that way, to treat a structure as a whole thing, as one functional unit. So yeah, there was that wish to go, let's say, to a different level of aggregate functioning, of network functioning. And then, yeah, my postdoc time at Caltech with the Hopfield lab indeed was a good entry to develop this. That is wonderful lab, ways to connect to neuroscientists and computationalists over there, and so that thing expanded into different ways to deal with reinforcement. The dominant paradigm at the time was dopamine, of course, as learning signal that was just coming up with the work of Peter Dayan and Sanofsky and others, Montague, and of course the complementary work by Wolfram Schultz in Fribourg in Switzerland at the time. And they, of course, developed this very powerful concept of dopamine as a learning signal, as prediction error signal. But I had some doubts because from my experimental work, dopamine didn't quite do in the brain slice what was predicted by that theory. So we found like zero effects on synaptic plasticity, as would be predicted by the theory. And there were a couple of other doubts. So there we started thinking in the Hopfield lab about alternative ways to get reinforcement learning done, mainly based on how the amygdala functions and prefrontal cortex functions. so then that same time, I think, unleashed another wave of thinking about consciousness also, which, yeah, is not exactly a topic for neural networks, but at some point you know you start thinking how to figure that one out. Because the problem had been sort of gnawing all the time, and um, well, when I got back to Holland from Caltech, there was more time to think about that and develop that topic. So yeah, it was also, if you're interested in consciousness, yeah, let's say the 80s and 90s were in neuroscience. Well, it's a bit of a taboo topic, really.
Yeah, it was the
uh,
C word, right? That was the
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, it's a dirty word. Certainly in the neuroscience community. I think in psychology it was already better, and certainly in philosophy. Yeah, for a while we kind of had to work around the term, but still work on it. That is, and then yeah, I think also due to the work of Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, the topic got a lot more traction and was drawn out of this sort of dark zone of neuroscience. But of course, the opinions are still varied. Many respectable colleagues still reject the topic as unapproachable. Um, but no, we see, well, yeah, we approximate it as close as we can. So, yeah.
Cyriel, yeah, there was already so much there and so many directions to go in, but there is uh, something that I had wanted to mention to you, and in the first part of what you said, the sort of link came up when Mac told me, that we were inviting you for a TRALF. I don't even know if you remember this paper and if it was a big paper for you, but I have one of your papers that sort of stands out as a paper that really helped me helped change my thinking about the brain. And when I started kind of studying, I guess the brain, I was coming more from, I guess, an understanding of sort of, clinical disorders and, pretty good neuroanatomy, but not good functional anatomy. And when I first started my PhD, which was on the frontostriatal loops, I fell in love with your Trends in Neuroscience review from 2004, the putting a spin on the dorsal ventral divide. And I don't know if you if you even remember it, or I don't know if it's become a paper that you hate and you don't believe anymore. But it just reminded me when you were sort of talking about the idea of seeing things of this sort of monolithic structure. I guess it was one of those papers that sort of helped me really understand the kind of different functional gradients in those kind of structures. And yeah, I went on actually to do my postdoc with Trevor Robbins, who's also on that paper with you. So it was a
Ah,
very
right.
a really formative
Yeah. Yeah.
paper for me. And yeah, I feel like you almost described a time where so much was equated with dopamine in this sort of learning theories. And I guess coming from Trevor's lab, I've always had a really good appreciation of the really complex roles of, noradrenaline and acetylcholine and things in learning and other things. And I guess, yeah, do you think that's when, it started this kind of, I guess, absolute dominance of dopamine, and we haven't really come back from it, especially in terms of learning?
Uh, yeah, I would say the early 90s with, let's say, the early publications from the Wolfram Schultz lab.
Mm.
But it's great you mentioned Trevor because we had such a wonderful time working together also, in European projects.
Yeah.
And I learned so much about experimental psychology from both Trevor and Barry Everett. And indeed, that paper you refer to is also written with two anatomists from Amsterdam and one behavioral neuroscientist, I believe. So that kind of multidisciplinary thinking I really like, and I guess there was a good soil or a fertile soil for this in Amsterdam, which has two universities, and we sort of did at the University of Amsterdam the physiology part with Lopez da Silva, and the VU had the anatomy part, but we kind of lacked indeed the behavioral and experimental psychology in that, and so Trevor and Barry already were early on already saying, well, yeah, we don't know if dopamine does act as a learning signal, but it invigorates behavior.
Yeah.
It
Sort of
motivates.
activational construct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that resonated with me also, and was much more in accordance with our experimental findings.
Yeah.
But that's yeah, that has been a huge inspiration, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Later on, yeah, we collaborated also with Barry and Trevor in a human frontiers science program that was very much centered on the hippocampus and ventral striatum. This is the kind of system where you rely on if you need to couple, let's say, place information to reward. So, like looking for nice places that you have been and experienced reward over there. Yeah.
So Cyriel, I often teased Claire back in her postdoctoral years that she was going from cognitive neuroscience to behaviorism by going to work with Trevor and Barry, because a lot of what they were doing was almost sort of banishing consciousness from the explanation or the level of explanation. Yet
Mhm.
you are so interested in consciousness, and I'm really curious to hear about that tension, working with anatomists and really great card-carrying physiologists that are down there doing really sort of molecular level perturbations of a system, but yeah, and then also trying to think, how do we explain this thing in front of us, that this difficult thing to put our finger on? Can you tell us a bit more about that tension and kind of how you grapple with that as a young scientist?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, like I said in the beginning, sort of 90s, 80s, it was mostly a taboo topic, I would say. And indeed, I think the huge majority of neuroscientists still work around it by, well, either saying the problem isn't there, the problem of how consciousness is implemented in the brain, or it's not approachable. It's not a thing you can measure, and it will forever remain evasive. And indeed, yeah, in the sort of Cambridge School of Experimental Psychology, it's not a huge topic. I don't exactly know where Trevor stands, but this was a struggle.
I
This,
did once ask him. One day we got the train from a meeting together in London, and I don't know, I was just taking the time to have him to myself and chat with him. And I kind of asked him. I said, "Oh, you do so much in different types of learning and emotion and all levels of behavior and species. But what do you think about consciousness? What would you put your money on?" And he said that his way of thinking about it would be just like the way we've kind of learned and developed how we think about intelligence and cognition, is that it'll turn out not just be one thing. The idea that we used
mm,
to think of kind of cognition and intelligence as a sort of monolithic thing, and yeah, he suggested that consciousness will sort of turn out to be something that we can separate into different things, and that's how we'll get
components.
yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, yeah. Uh, but you're right, Meg, that there is this tension, and it's sort of sat uncomfortably with me for a number of years, and I wanted to go back and at some point grab a chance to really work on it, which occurred when I got this full professorship at the UVA, University of Amsterdam, in 2004. But yeah, the dissatisfaction arises, for instance, if you read books of more people who take a deflationary approach and say, well, we call something something consciousness, but it is really something else, or it isn't really there. It is dispositions in our brain and that we're predisposed to react certain ways. So if you read, for instance, Daniel Dennett, his book Consciousness Explained, well-known bestseller in our field. Yeah, he takes this example of colors. So pictures, in which are numbers in certain forms, and children have to paint in the colors for those numbers, and then he says, but basically that's what color is. It's sort of not something secretive. It's something we talk about, and then we actually refer with our talking to brain processes, dispositions. But to me, sort of, yeah, that I couldn't agree with that. I mean, you kind of skip important phenomenology there, the seeing of colors, imagining things. So lots of internal processes, of course. So that led me to investigate it further, and that led to a branch that I was happy enough to develop at the University of Amsterdam, both with neuroscience testing pertaining to perception, consciousness, multisensory integration versus the modeling and theory. Yeah, I think we're sort of part on the way. I mean, there are pretty good predictive coding approaches, for instance. These are models, as you might know, where brain structures try to predict what's going on in terms of causes of sensory inputs, the concept based on Helmholtz. Multi-layer structures where more and more abstract representations are being created of objects that are causing these sensory inputs to change, and link that to action. So eventually, I think that is a multidisciplinary, multi-lag approach, which yeah, which is out there, and I really think and notice that, yeah, when talking to people, you need these branches. So try to complete the experimental theory cycle. They say, well, this and this theory has such implications. It must be good enough to test experimentally. And then the experiments give an outcome. And then, well, you might have to adjust or reject the theory, or in very rare cases, confirm it. But yeah, that's the way to go. It's a slow path, but very much fun also. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. We've had some discussions about this together, both in an office and then over dinner with plenty of wine. And I think that one of the challenges we struggle with a little bit locally is that it's very hard to really pin down a lot of the kind of leading theories of consciousness, or even theories of kind of higher brain function, to very particular predictions. There's so much wiggle room. The brain is this sort of massively high dimensional object, and it's sort of this weird spatiotemporal object too that we don't even really know the right ways to characterize yet. And so getting people to be able to say, I think this exact thing will happen and not these other things, is extremely rare. I don't think I've come across a situation where anyone would be that willing to kind of expose such a kind of a risky opportunity for being wrong. And I think that maybe speaks to our field being young, but I think it's also an opportunity for us as scientists to kind of figure out what that language ought to look like. What do we expect a really satisfying theory of a higher brain function to look like? What characteristics should it have? What should it not have? What language should it be written in? What should it be able to tell us? What shouldn't it be able to tell us? And I think that's actually a really interesting sort of space to be in. I'm curious to hear your thoughts if that aligns with how you think.
What the good theory holds, it differs quite a bit, I think, based on what function we are looking at. So, for instance, working memory models are fairly well tractable these days, testable. So, a lot of computational work has been done on attractor models, mean field, more specific neural networks for it. My colleague Jorge Mejias, as you know, is working on whole brain models in that respect. So let's say following the path from a visual stimulus that's activating visual cortex to storage actually higher up in parietal frontal areas. So in a way that's fairly well tractable. We know something of the neurophysiology underlying it, monkey physiology, but also rat work, the pharmacology. So that's in part there. I think I would agree there that it's not an easy problem as David Chalmers would put it, but it's a tractable problem, and that's consistent with what this philosopher says about it. And yeah, processes like attention, let's say the individual cognitive components of a process are often quite well tractable through prefrontal basal ganglia loops, behavioral studies. It's really productive to, I think, dive into this, like Trevor also does and others, and look at both lesion studies and pharmacology and computational models and experimental neurophysiology, and the anatomy. And the anatomy is really the basis of everything. Without that, we're sort of lost. And that, yeah, is a huge amount of work, but it does pay off. Consciousness is a bit of a different beast, I would say. Because also, yeah, once you tackle it, let's say with a computational model, it also escapes you in a way, which is, yeah, due to the fact, well, you're looking at simulations, it's all, of course, pumping around of numerical values and computations, and that's different from phenomenology, or at least it's not apparent how, let's say, low-level computational processes like summations, integrations, etc., why that would lead to phenomenology, why seeing the color red. So in a way, computations can approach it, but it will never sort of show on the screen like the model I'm seeing red right now. There again, we resort to behavioral output. And so it's a different beast in the sense, I think, that it requires a slightly different way of thinking. This is not to say that computation isn't useful for it, because it's one of the few ways in which we can get close. We can approximate it. For myself, at some point, being inspired by people like Hopfield, but also David Marr, they said, well, let's not look at the brain as some kind of device that some parts have it that they transmit sensory input and others read it out. They interpret the information. A classic example would be the prefrontal cortex, who's reading in the sensory input and lots of other things, and then gives you the interpretation, or kind of. And I thought, well, that's not going to work at the cell level, the way we usually think about it. So we shouldn't think of this as a serial processing mechanism, where eventually there's one sort of homunculus brain area that reads it out and does it all for you. But we have to think of it as a multi-level system, where the levels are not like V1 and the hierarchy, but are specified a bit more like David Marr said. So he said there's a implementation level. That's the, let's say, synaptic anatomy of the brain. Above that, there's an algorithmic level. Let's say the calculation procedures that you use, and above that is computational level. I think we can extend it in a way to say, well, there's another level of phenomenology on top of that, which is a connection we don't properly understand, but we can, in an abstract way, reason that, let's say, all the smaller level computations have to be integrated into this bigger thing that would be the conscious experience.
Well, so let me push you on that a little bit then, Cyriel. So if you want to admit another level to some organisms or some objects and not others, what then would be the difference between the organization of, say, the chair that I'm sitting on, that we wouldn't want to give the phenomenal consciousness to, and a biological system? Is it something in the inner workings? Is it in an implementation level detailed? Is there the fact that you can transmit calcium and potassium in particular ways? Is it an algorithmic level capability? Is it the fact that you can process information in a certain way? Is it a computational one? One's that the fact that you want to stay alive and create some boundary between yourself and the rest of the world, or something like that? Where do you kind of see the magic in the equation in that kind of language?
So I think the way to picture it, and of course this is a particular view amongst dozens of consciousness theories, so one has to appreciate that there's this great diversity, and some theories will be closer to it than others, like active inference, for instance, is closer. But the way I picture it or present it is to say, well, there's the level of neurons as a basic unit of representation. what can a neuron do? It might react to a particular feature in the environment. Let's take a V1 cell that responds to an oriented bar somewhere in the visual field. But that's not very, informative yet. That cell won't have, you can't say it has knowledge about the synaptic inputs it receives. It's not sort of generating this knowledge. The cell doesn't know it's in V1. That's us saying that as experimenters. So we then have to think of this V1 cell working in an aggregate of other V1 cells and engaging in generating basal representations or predictions, more or less in line with predictive coding. So the trick there would be, well, let's try to represent as a brain what's out there, let's say a bar in the visual field, and there are already numerous neurons in V1 engaging in that, and they, together with higher areas like V4, generate this prediction or representation, which is basically an hypothesis of what's going on. So that should be understood in terms of a best guess representation. And that's all in line with the more classical theory of Round Ballard, and Carl Friston worked on it, and many others. But then you could say, well, yeah, but that's just one isolated attribute of an object. Let's say bar would be shape. And we also have to, of course, to deal with color information, texture, movement, lots of other visual attributes. And they have to be also integrated into the supposed object that there is. Again, their philosophy plays a role because, all we get to the brain are extrapotential trains, basically, across the optic nerve and other cranial nerves. And so the brain has no direct access to the external world. That's content that we talk about. The Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is not directly accessible, but we try to make reconstructions of it. We try to sort of generate this, representation. Actually, currently we're working with a postdoc, Kwan-Jung Lee, on a model that integrates shape with color information. And so that takes the individual features or attributes together and says, well, how can we now contribute to a common object representation based on color and shape? And there's the associated problem of binding also, like how do you put these properties together and generate a representation in which they're united? So then we talk about integrating small level predictions into a bigger one that would come somewhat closer to what we would call a visual object. But then any sort of representation at that level still needs to be identified as visual. And that's also particular operations. So the trick is to imagine this, that you are the brain, or you're a bunch of nerve cells, and you don't know anything, but you just have to figure out what's going on. So there is no visual object to begin with. We have to tease out, based on the inputs, how we can construct it. And so let's say the visual quality of it is not a given, because any neural pattern could also be a somatosensory pattern. Think of a sort of a representation of neurons forming a face. If that's just a neural pattern, it might as well belong to a somatotopic map in the somatosensory cortex, or it could be part of a tonotopic map. So this is what we've labeled a modality identification problem, and that's how brain areas must work together to identify, let's say, spike trains as such as being of a particular quality or modality, given olfaction, vision, audition, somatosensation, etc., taste. And that's the intriguing problem of that our modal systems in the brain do have unique feature detectors sometimes. Like color, right, is quite peculiar to vision. You don't find it in any other modality. Um, but then these sort of unique feature detectors by themselves are not yet enough to say, well, um, color sensitive cells firing is not enough to say, well, I now see color. Um, so that's why, yeah, there is the hypothesis of another level of integration, the sort of more multimodal integration level, also making this spatial, in which, let's say, the visual object hypotheses come together with tactile, auditory, and then we begin to get close to the transition to phenomenology. Um, so yeah,
Okay,
that's
so
a long story.
you see the oh no no thank you for unpacking. I really appreciate it. So you sort of see the phenomenal consciousness as kind of a integration of all of the different streams of information at some higher level coming together and some like an informational object almost that is then somehow imbued with the um, features that we would describe as subjective experience.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, quite often people ask, well, yeah, can't you can't you show this in some way that this happens? Right now, show me that from, let's say, the computational models, I get a plausible phenomenology out, and that cannot be shown. Sorry to say, but we cannot conjure up some orange color from a bunch of neural activities. That transition in a way is abstract. We cannot imagine it because our imaginations are bound by experience. They're sort of based on our memories, on previous percepts. And so, as a subject, we don't have a sort of keyhole to look down into our own neural representations. The best we sort of can do is tease out these levels and find out what the neural correlates are of experience and try to model that. And then in neuroscience, we can also causally manipulate the system, like optogenetics in mice or monkeys, perhaps. Um, so that is sort of slowly gnawing away at the edges to get closer to this boundary. But we won't be able to show, well, let's say you have a bunch of neurons active in the brain, and that's, yeah, well, there's orange, there's the color orange or so. That is unfortunately not a given to us. But that's not so hopeless because in physics it's actually not uncommon to have that situation. Imagine the Big Bang, and we think of explosions, but actually space and time would also have to come into existence in the Big Bang. And so what does an exploding space look like? A space that comes into existence. It's very hard to imagine, as well as particular aspects of quantum mechanics. So we shouldn't be deterred that we have these limits in our imagination. Um, Especially if you want to model these things, then you know it might be that it might seem that you're working on a jambalaya of numbers, but um, at another level, that could mean really something different that we can't see. Um,
Yeah, I think this sort of underscores just how difficult this field is in many ways because not only do you have to be able to think about a problem that is very difficult and slippery and challenging to even pin down, but you then have to be able to come up with a um, coherent framework in which to embed it. You then have to be able to come up with a crucial experiment that would be able to test the variable. You have to have the capacity and steady hand to actually conduct said experiment at a high level and get good data. You then got to be able to interpret that data in light of the predictions that you've made and then be able to understand the statistics of a really complex organism or response in order to test it. So it's this incredibly difficult set of things. It's no wonder that we've, as a field, not yet kind of developed this coherence together because I think we are really sort of tackling a massive challenge. So I think probably don't know if I speak for every single person on the call, but the conversations that we have locally resonate very much with what you're suggesting here as the kind of right step forward, which is to essentially say, make neurobiologically informed predictions based on modeling experiments that stretch your intuition about the way that the system could work beyond just a couple of variables and try to take on board this notion of kind of emergent synergistic properties of a complex nervous system, and then try to ask what would the signatures look like if I change some important variable, and then go and test whether or not that intuition is correct or incorrect. It's not to say that our models that we create will be the correct one. They could very well be wrong in ways that we're not aware of, but the key thing is to make the prediction and then test it and then update it. And it's this constant, I think, conversation that we can have together when our models are made explicit. That's the really crucial thing that I think is going to catalyze rapid progress in this field. So I think we're on the same page with that.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, yeah. In consciousness, we have to deal with different taxonomies because there are so many different theories. I think the first thing we need to do is talk to each other and find out what definition you are using of consciousness, because often it turns out to be hugely different. For some people, indeed, consciousness is more about decision making and the motor system. I constantly decided to buy some stuff. And for others, like myself, it's much more on the phenomenology side. So that's a split that you see between a theory called global neuronal workspace of Stan de Haan and Changeux, which is much more directed towards the access side, towards executive function and attention, working memory. Whereas other theories, including the stuff I talked about, is much more about phenomenology. And then there's the stream of higher order thought theories, which is in a way looking more at reflective consciousness. So being conscious of something, that there needs to be a subject that is aware of something. There needs to be a judgment of what's real. So perceptual reality monitoring. So that's yet a different way. I would put it not in the domain of, let's say, raw sensory feel, but rather reflection. So self-awareness is much more, it's requiring a couple of more steps to distinguish the self as a body, as an agent, and a mind. So taxonomy is hugely important. We kind of wrote this paper with our HBP group, that is the subgroup of the Human Brain Project that worked on consciousness, with people like Marcello Massimini and Stephen Lorais and Matthew Larkham, and many others. And there we at some point we said, well, our theories are very different, but let's try to integrate them and see how far we get with that. The first thing you discover is these different definitions, and once you point them out, things are less incompatible than they seemed. So you can say, well, IIT, Integrated Information Theory of Tononi, is asking a different question than global neural workspace theory, and thereby are already not necessarily incompatible. Of course, there are also assumptions that are incompatible, and that's where it becomes important to, I think the adversarial testing, as we do it in the program sponsored by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, the Accelerating Research and Consciousness program, is a good example of how possibly to get forward. Because so far, let's say, these individual theorists, they test their own assumptions, and quite often they tend to be confirmative of their own theories, because you can also design the experiments in a way that sort of is likely to test the aspects that you find important. But the adversarial collaborations allow a chance to pit the theories against each other and then say, okay, IIT Tononi's theory predicts this, and active inference supported by Carl Friston and others, predicts another thing about the importance of motor action for consciousness, for instance. So that it's a bit of a more systematic way to compare theories and try to get at the critical differences. So yeah, we hope that kind of approach is pursued rather than working on these little islands of consciousness, so to say.
Chris, I think you maybe had a question for Cyriel.
Yeah, sure. So this is both kind of a historical question and a methodological one. So I'm curious how it is that you moved from like reinforcement learning to multisensory integration, and why it is that you chose multisensory integration. Was it because it was kind of an experimentally tractable way to get into something that was kind of relevant to consciousness, but you could still do it in animal models? And I'm curious about kind of the link. So you're in Amsterdam, obviously, but Wolfsinger's just next door. And I guess when you said you established your lab in 2004, this is kind of the heyday of binding by synchrony and all of these type of things. So I'm kind of, what was like in the air when you kind of made that move?
Yeah, I guess the transition from reinforcement learning to multisensory wasn't very direct. It was more that I got the opportunity as with this chair in cognitive and systems neuroscience to, yeah, also research new directions. And so it's something I wanted to do anyway. And from this theory, this neurorepresentationalism, it follows that brain areas supporting different modalities have to interact. And teasing that out then is for me an important component to work on consciousness, actually. Of course, one has to be aware that there are different takes to study multisensory integration. Some of it, like cue integration, can also happen unconsciously, and you find it in leeches and all kinds of terrible animals. But in the sense meant, like explained, you need these modalities to work together to identify actually what their position in a relational topology is, was quite essential, yeah. And then several things come together, like you have computational experience, somewhat at least. There's the experimental neurophysiology you know about, and all the animal work. And meanwhile, we also got a chance to do some human neuroscience with brain imaging, which in a way is complementary to the animal work. So animals, of course, allow much more to record much more single neurons, ensembles of neurons. Human, more EEG, sort of more higher aggregate levels. But of course, we have there the interrogation of humans, that they can talk about their experiences, which is also somewhat of an advantage. So So no real direct connection, except of course that the reinforcement learning models provide a lot of computational background and do provide, let's say, an entry into predictive coding also. That's an important one. They both work on the basis of error learning. So it was not too difficult to make that transition to predictive coding. Yeah. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess if I could ask a quick follow-up then. So in that paper you referenced earlier, this was the Storm et al. Kind of paper in Neuron.
Yeah.
Everyone from the Human Brain Project kind of who work on consciousness came together. And one of the things you talk about in that paper is you seem to place a large emphasis on studying consciousness in animal models and the importance of this kind of multi-scale perspective. And of course, I mean, I agree. But I think the pushback that you hear is always that the report, we have to infer that perception indirectly, right? There's some sense in which kind of human reports or subjective reports always have to have a primacy. I'm kind of wondering how you think about that tension and the place of animal models in consciousness research.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, one has to be careful about it. I mean, we always struggle in animal models, like, are we looking at behavioral report or something behind it, something conscious? Basically, there are similar problems in the human research, even though there we have the verbal reports. But it's always a kind of post hoc construct, you could say. And there's an advantage actually to work in Amsterdam with psychologists like Simon van Gaal and others who tell us, well, there are very subtle differences in the psychophysical paradigms one uses when interrogating people about what they saw. So depending on the way you ask the question, they can have a bias to report something that they actually wouldn't have reported as having seen under a different question. So the way of questioning the whole paradigm is already set to contain a potential bias in that respect. There's perceptual awareness skills, like a colleague like Simon van Gaal reports that these are subtle but important deviations. So also, for instance, if you ask, you show a stimulus on a screen and you want to know, was a person conscious of this? So you ask, well, what did you see? Then you get an answer like, I saw a cat or a dog. But that's already so much more than a simple percept. It's a semantic identification that we do. So we do some kind of categorization there that says, so if you ask, did you see something, that's easier. And then you don't have to report or describe what you saw, but you just say, well, I was aware of something that happened. This way of questioning is hugely important. It's not to say that animal studies are better, but I think it's complementary. I think we have to use it both. The human neuroscience can, let's say, point us to the larger scale brain structures involved through fMRI, and now that goes down to the layers, lamina. The animal models are still needed for the causal interventions and detailed recordings. But there's a lot possible in animal studies. Yeah, so we just completed a study on mouse parietal cortex, also in this kind of multisensory paradigm. And the mice have to lick right to indicate they saw something or not. To the left when they saw something not. And there you can couple, for instance, the detailed spike recordings to the timing of the behavioral response. So you can say, well, our neurons there in the PPC are temporarily locked to the behavioral responding or to the stimulus as seen. So in that process, there's in fact some dissociation possible between behavioral report and stimulus processing. Yeah, but then you still have to infer a lot. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah. So we have to do this both, and then there are the recordings from epileptic patients, of course, which do give you a single neuron access, single unit recordings. Rare cases, but important, even though it's in a pathological situation. And there you see also the same difficulties again. So people would say, I have seen this. I thought of Homer Simpson or in a movie or so. And then the Homer Simpson cell lights up in the hippocampus or medial temporal lobe area, like the Jennifer Aniston cells. And then you yet don't know whether there was a memory recall or conscious re-experience. And there's a difference. Memory recall could be pre-NCC, as it's so pre-neural correlative consciousness. And other neuronal activities could be post-NCC. So consciousness happened and then some memory storage took place or so. So basically you're confronted with the same problems there. So it's a matter of then going into the details and teasing out really what is going on. But feel free to respond.
I don't know, Chris, if you had any follow-up, but go for it if you do. Yeah, I was thinking about something, Cyril, when I dipped back into your papers, but before we yeah, earlier this Savo, and I don't know if it's my misreading, but it seems with the sort of in the neuro representational papers that consciousness is, I don't know, maybe not exclusively, but quite tied to goal-directed behavior, and contrasted, I guess, against habits and reflexes. And I guess I can see a contrast with reflexes, but I guess, when I think about habits, I think habits, we're definitely, I don't know, executing them in a different mode, I think. But habitual behavior can be so rich, and our experience of it can be sort of so in depth. And I guess I just wondered, yeah, is that my misreading that consciousness is much more tied to goal-directed behavior? Or then, yeah, I guess where does habits fit in that account?
Yeah, I see where it comes from. Yeah, um,
So
habit.
I've
Uh,
probably read the bit in the paper you wish people skipped over and wouldn't ask you about.
no, 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 no. That's a perfect question. No, indeed. The way I try to explain it usually to people is habits more as automated stimulus response behaviors, not too complex, and understood in the way of, yeah, like Anthony Dickinson and others, like Trevor explain it. So these are oft repeated behaviors that become habitual. That is, we don't think very much about the consequences. We do them, and only if something goes wrong, let's say you pedal on your bicycle, you don't think of every muscular contraction or movement you make. Consciously, you're just, yeah, busy with something else, and that's what you like to do. You think about your plans for dinner, etc. Um, so in that way, habits are a great way to offload information from consciousness and do it all the automated way, be it through the basal ganglia or the cerebellum. Um, and then, yeah, the conscious bit, the goal-directed behavior, has to do with more complex decision making. Is this component? I mean, there are two senses of goal-directed action. One is, okay, we make an eye movement and it's goal-directed because it goes somewhere. I reach the goal, it's where your saccade lands, and that's your desired goal at that moment. The way that Bernard Berlin and Anthony Dickinson talk about is more representational. So we have a representation already before we start the action. You know that the action is causally important to getting to the goal, and the outcome really matters to you. That is, if you start to fiddle with the value of the outcome, then you will not pursue the goal-directed action anymore. Let's say, if you're sated, you eat 3 plates of spaghetti and then you don't desire spaghetti anymore, so you won't go after it. So that's the sense meant, and the idea is basically that what consciousness gives you, or as a function, a biological function also, is this sort of wonderfully rich overview of your situation, right? It's now probably behind a laptop, but it's usually more environmental, bigger around you. And so, yeah, what is that good for? It basically, yeah, gives you this overview, which is a stable world overview, to be able to navigate. Because if you wouldn't have that, then yeah, you could still rely on reflexes or habits, but there's no, yeah, let's say, empirical support for planning your actions. Like, yeah, so maybe an alarm bell rings and you have to get out of your room suddenly, so you have to very quickly know where the door is to enter it. And this is not only like your plan at the moment, but also potential plans, like contingencies that happen, things that go wrong. So we only, yeah, it's not enough to know your sort of planned path at the moment, but take into account all these action options and be able to deliberate on it. So the claim is that consciousness subserves that function. It's not equal to goal-directed action,
Yeah.
but it's supported in informing you about what's possible.
Okay.
And we introduce this notion of time, which is that there, yeah, is a certain temporal depth to cross. So habits are typically short-term actions, but this goal-directed action is like all the branches into the future of your action space. And that's a notion shared with the active inference view, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. So do you think that means that really simple organisms, that I guess not just say rely on reflex, but maybe one step up, that sort of rely on very simple stimulus response, model-free type learning, they shouldn't be conscious because they don't need to be?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Model free indeed would be cached behaviors. The main thing is the value that is being stored, the emotional or motivational value for future actions. And that's is very useful for, let's say, very fast actions. We don't need a lot of computation and deliberation to do them. In this model that actually Giovanni Pezzulo's group made, and we sort of delivered data for it, they also said there can be a competition, but also a collaboration between habitual model-free systems and model-based. And model-based here would not equate with consciousness per se. I mean, you can have model-based systems without invoking that whole concept. But consciousness as, let's say, your situational overview that you have is very much more akin to model-based than model-free. Yeah. And yeah, Giovanni showed with his group that model organisms will switch, let's say, when there is great uncertainty in your environment, to use more model-based, and then make the habitual system more predominant if the certainty is greater about action outcomes. So
yeah, so maybe just taking up the idea of Giovanni's work a little bit. I'm not familiar with all of his work, but I'm quite attracted to some of the work that he did with Paul Chizek on the sort of affordance competition hypothesis, of essentially saying a really sensible way to think about the kinds of problems that an animal has to solve and the kinds of problems that it can solve is essentially thinking, what is it capable of actually identifying in the environment? What could it actually spot as a potential set of problems in order to solve? And if you then think about it like that, then you can start think about consciousness as something that an organism could deploy in order to actually bring its computational capacities to bear on the problem at hand. So if you're a monkey sitting in a tree, you can use your perceptual resources to determine whether or not the grapes that are over there on that branch are sufficiently far enough away that I could get them, but the branch is strong enough that I could go onto it. And so it's all about finding the affordances in the environment that allow you to become adaptive. And my read of that, the implications of that work, is that they would actually trace consciousness being as an adaptive sort of capability in organisms much further back than and it sounds like you'd want to warrant it, right? I feel like if you talk to Paul, he might be quite comfortable saying something like a little fish in an estuary, way back in the day, some little lamprey has the capacity for consciousness in this sense, where it can grab some part of its perceptual experience and boost it so that it can actually do the functional thing it needs to do, avoid the predator, whatever. Is that controversial to you, or is it about different definitions of consciousness, and how should we think about this?
I think it is controversial in the sense that there's a big contrast, let's say, between having imagery and having these surveying representations, as opposed to what the lamprey does. I'm not saying a lamprey would be entirely unconscious. I don't know. But let's say, do you need in your model consciousness to satisfy representational needs of the organism to accomplish the behavior that the organism is doing? And so then is a kind of reflexive loop sufficient to explain the behavior, or a habitual system perhaps?
So can you say more about what you mean by representational needs?
Yeah. Imagine, we're sitting here, right? And we have this more or less stable view of the laptop plus your surrounds, I guess. You have that? Can you confirm that?
Yes, yes.
Um, and that's entirely not a given to have it, right? Because your retinas do receive photic input, light input, of course, and that is processed in V1 and so on. But it would never yield you this stable picture if you didn't take into account your eye movements or head movements. So these are happening constantly, and it causes the objects on your screen to shift around, basically. They occupy different retinal positions all the time. And so there must be a way to compensate for that. We can use efference copy. So once the motor system can talk to the visual system, there's a way to correct for that. But this is complicated. You need vestibular input to take into account head movements. Sensory reafference, so let's say the direct sensory feedback from your eye muscle spindles, that's proprioception, back into the visual system is needed. So there's a lot of integration needed already to have a simple, stable visual picture. That's also why we call V1 as visual cortex is a bit of a misnomer, because it's photic cortex, right? It's where the light information comes in, and then you need to do all this more computational stuff really to get vision, to get visual perception. And so I think these systems are very old in evolution, and probably these developed in organisms like lampreys and other simple vertebrates, or simple, well, but it doesn't mean they have this kind of world stabilized view. And I think we need it as primates, as human primates, to navigate. So yeah, identifying already that there's a bunch of grapes there that I want to grab is a complicated operation to do that consciously, but it's also tremendously useful, of course. But we can also see what's behind the grapes. Is there maybe a predator lurking? This whole situational overview, like how to get into the tree. So I'm not saying that the lamprey has no representational need. It might have it already. But there are also organisms, I think, like Paramecium. This is the single cell organism that also moves around and recoils. That kind of organism, I would claim, does not need consciousness to explain its behavior. That's a matter of, the cilia moving around and going forward, bumping into something, recoiling based on calcium influx and ionic channel behavior. So it's that behavior, you don't need something complicated as consciousness to explain it. And it doesn't need this sort of encompassing worldview to behave.
Gotcha. So you must be attracted to the ideas of Malcolm McIver about the kind of complexity of the challenge of terrestrial vertebrates kind of coming onto land, having to deal with all this different light, all these different kinds of angles, all these different kinds of degrees of freedom, creating a kind of computational challenge for the system to overcome. Is that, are you familiar with this word? Do you like that way of thinking?
Yeah, I like that comes closer, and then you need the temporal depth of action. Yeah. So having a sufficiently rich world overview that it allows you to plan these steps ahead and say, well, I could go here, but that's maybe risky because there's a bush and there could be predators, or I could take that path, which is maybe a bit more boring, but also safer to take.
Yeah.
And that's taking into account all these factors, which more or less have come together in let's say half a second for a medium to fast decision. So you have time to think about, to contemplate, to deliberate. So it's not as fast as a reflex, and not as fast as a habit, but that's the price of paying, taking a bit more time for your deliberate decision.
Yeah. I can't help but have Claire's comment about Trevor's comment about consciousness sort of ricocheting around my head here, where to think maybe this is kind of what he was getting towards, right? There's certain aspects of consciousness which are your ability to sense the world with whatever apparatus you've been given and navigate it as you see fit. And then there's these more elaborate senses of the word consciousness, which are now how do you deploy all of the incredible resources that you've been given and your experience with the world and all the different capacities you have in order to do the thing that you want to do. And it strikes me that this is going to be a really fun space to start asking really good neurobiologically inspired questions about, because it actually gets kind of controversial, right? Like I'd say one of the things that humans are actually really good at is actually doing things automatically. Is actually not using our consciousness for particular anything, right? The fact that I can drive my car, I'm not sitting there and thinking about the fact that I'm extending my tibialis anterior muscle 48% when I'm pushing on the brake pedal in order to come up to the stoplight. I'm thinking about this other concept of some paper that I'm working on, and my brain somehow manages to coordinate that with my body in the car without me thinking about it. And this is not really consciousness at all. It's something that my consciousness has trained my system to do. But it's really fun to think about these capacities, and maybe consciousness needs to take a bit of a back seat for some of these explanations to become more rich. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. One example, I agree. One relevant example is, okay, you touch your hot stove in your home by accident, right? And then that's where you withdraw your hand in a reflex. You don't need conscious for it. It happens before you know it. But then the interesting question comes, you feel this burning pain in your hand. Why is that? Because your hand is already into safety. You brought it there. So why bother about the whole conscious painful experience? And I think the take on that is both to plan what's next. So, how are you going to treat this burned wound or pain? Where's the cold water tap? So that's subsequent to reflexes. And it's also a learning experience, like why the hell was your hand in that situation to get burned, and what caused that? So then the consciousness also might subserve a learning process. Yeah, but you're right, it's a balance of offloading things from consciousness and then having the space to really, be conscious of what you really care about for your planning, for your life. And the bits that can be offloaded are also really good to look at. The famous World War British doctor, Gordon Holmes, described the Holmes syndrome, which is that, these gunshot wounds in the British shoulders caused big cerebellar lesions. And these people, besides having ataxia, but they really had to think about all their movements. So then you see, well, the cerebellum is actually very useful for offloading stuff and keeping it out of your, let's say, conscious domain. Because if you miss it, then, all these actions are not automated anymore, which I find fascinating, as well as the question of, well, why does the cerebellum, with all its cells and its complexity, does not generate consciousness or is not part of this game? But that's another question, yeah.
But my understanding is that may be a little more controversial than we take as a field, right? I know that there's this kind of standard thought, oh, the cerebellum's not involved in consciousness, but I think maybe we've been asking the question a little bit wrong. And I think that if we look carefully, we'll actually find the cerebellum will be very heavily involved in consciousness, not just whether or not you are conscious, but the kinds of ways in which you can become conscious. It'll be involved in more like the verb parts of consciousness rather than the noun yes or no. That's just a hedge at this stage, but it almost seems like it has to be, given the complexity of the circuitry and how eminently it's involved in the rest of the process.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know yet. There are also people that claim that maybe the cerebellum is conscious, but the rest of the brain just doesn't know about it. So kind of hidden micro consciousness, but that's very hard to test.
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, on the one hand, I agree with the Trevor's view that consciousness has all these components that we need to tease out, and Yeah, for me that's mainly, perception, imagery, dreaming, so the real experiencing part, but not yet the action component, which we take to be separate. Part of that is that consciousness survives so many removal of functions in the brain. So people can lose long-term memory and still be conscious, like HM, hippocampal amnesia. People can lose working memory and still be conscious. I mean, they forget almost immediately what they saw, but they're still conscious. And people can lose a lot of their emotionality and they stay conscious. Think of prefrontal lesions, amygdala lesions. So, yeah, there's so much that can be lost. You can lose language. There are many philosophers who would claim that language is the thing for consciousness. But people with global aphasia are still conscious. You can have language production without consciousness, like in some epileptic patients that occurs, linguistic automatisms. Yeah, no motor behavior. Think of locked-in patients. Had long discussions with, the active inference school of thought. We have cases of amelia. These are people that are born without limbs, so they have congenital absence of limbs, and they still describe phantom sensations in those limbs, in their fingers, which they don't have. So, this is also highly internal, a matter of internal brain representations that are being generated. So there's a lot you can miss. So I also tend to think, well, consciousness is not necessarily dependent on a lot of other cognitive processes or motor processes. And yeah, with like anesthesia, there's also, it's one process that gets lost. And I'm sure it's very complicated. There we agree. But we also sort of still need to look for a unitary basis, I think, of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally agree. So Cyriel, we're reaching the kind of end of our time here. This has been absolutely fantastic and everything I hoped it would be. Is there anything that you would like to touch on that we haven't talked about yet, or any sort of words of wisdom and advice you'd like to impart to impressionable young scientists halfway across the world?
Oh, a difficult one. Yeah, these are difficult moments of coming up with big words. But I could say something, and then I'd like to hear your reactions also a bit on that, like what your view is, particular because as a younger scientist, you know you're not so ingrained in the trench-wise thinking of more senior people, and maybe more open to current developments. But yeah, like I told, one sort of general recommendation is to make your science life adventurous. And um, this is difficult because you want also a safe path. You want to get papers out and have a career in science, and therefore you need papers and conference talks and such. But on the side, try to go the sort of untrodden path as well, and see where that brings you. So yeah, enjoy these things that are not so much explored, and yeah, maybe not go there all the way to yeah, that might be risky, but if you enjoy this, yeah, I would encourage you to do so, and also take the multidisciplinary path of broadening your horizon, which is a bit of a cliche, but for me it worked in a fantastic way. Um, but maybe, yeah, I'd like to hear your views as well on that.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love this old quote that's I've heard attributed to David Bowie, but he may have learned it from someone else. But he said, whenever you're doing something in life, you should try to kind of make it as if you're trying to go swimming, but you're just at the point where your feet can't touch the ground anymore. So you're feeling a little bit stressed, a little bit worried that you can't quite swim. You have to work to stay afloat. And I think there's something really true about that, that if you can find your edge and the point that you feel a little bit overwhelmed, that you're surrounded by really intelligent people that are way smarter than you are in the area that you're in, and you're constantly having to learn, you can't go wrong because you're essentially going to be developing and growing in every step. So I think that echoes what you were saying.
Hmm. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Are there any other burning questions from the group for Cyriel while we have him?
Um,
Oh yeah, go ahead. You go.
Actually, uh, actually, I have a question. Going into the backdrop sort of topic, do you think that's sort of related to the free energy principle and that sort of information integration theory? Whereas if we look at the conscious process as in terms of a predictive coding perspective, that it's constantly building a model of the world around us, then if there's no information coming in, so if you're driving, you know how to drive and the world around you is familiar, then there's no need for and there's all free energy and there's no need for consciousness to sort of come in and take a front seat in that process. Do you think that's sort of a relatable, notion of how to interpret that process?
Yeah, yeah, I can relate very much to free energy. Roughly the reduction of prediction errors, but then extended in various ways. I think the way Carl Friston and others have developed it is a bit more towards an activism. So indeed, interacting with the world. You basically start with a motor system that has certain expectations in it, and thereby undertake certain actions that then give you new sensory feedback to update your world model. So the components of sensory feedback and world model are similar to what I said. The main difference is that, in my view, action is not needed per se for consciousness, because of the clinical cases of locked in and Amelia and so on. So for me, the motor system is very important also to get this stabilized worldview. But if it's not there, people can still be conscious. So there is a difference, but yeah, I think it's a great thing to have these unifying principles that work across predictive coding, but also reinforcement learning and connecting these computational domains. That is a big merit. A bit of a risk, I think, with free energy is that you computationalize things so much that consciousness vanishes out of the equations. So at some point you might not see anymore why any phenomenology is needed or is there. And that's why I stressed a bit the multi-level thinking about it. Yeah.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. Like if we
Yeah.
look at the consciousness as sort of a intrinsic experience, so following that sort of philosophical psychology view on it, and so if it has so each intrinsic experience for everyone under specific circumstances have like a unique set of phenomenological elements, and
Mm-hmm.
if you add mental representation to that, so like if you think of an apple, that some people just think of the word apple and some one picture a picture of the apple, and if you add that to it, would that create a big obstacle, experimentally wise or technical wise, to sort of access the intrinsic conscious experience from different participants and from very vastly different contexts while focusing on different things? Or does that sort of justifies or validate the approach of multimodal, multisensory sort of methodologies?
Yeah, it's a good question. Complicated with many components. I have to say, yeah, the intrinsic part. I would agree in the sense that we can close our eyes and have representations that are generated by the brain and don't need the environmental interaction per se. What's I find a bit difficult if you refer to IIT as the integrated information theory of Tononi, that yeah, the axioms he outlines that they would be needed for yield a consciousness, conscious experience per se. There in IIT, there's no, let's say, reality matching principle. So basically, any system that is able to generate enough integration by connectivity and differentiation by having heterogeneous patterns would be sufficient to yield consciousness. Even activity is not needed per se. Yeah, but why would it yield a conscious representation that makes sense to us, or a conscious presentation that makes sense? There's nothing in there that says, well, you know, this might be useful for you to use in your behavior. Somehow what we see, what we are aware of is similar to external reality in a way. And so also the distinction between hallucination and perception isn't there. A hallucination is as valid as an intrinsic thing as a real percept. So those kind of distinctions one would need to work on. So in that sense, my account is much more linked to sensory processing. It's about representing, so in a way reconstructing the world as best as it can. Tononi is more about presentation. It says phenomenology first, and then we go from there. But we talk a lot, Giulio, Tononi, and I, and we sort of make a list of where are we different, where are we similar. There are also similarities, but overall, I would say representations are intrinsic. You can have them in the brain generates it, but our way of experiencing them is that they happen externally, right? This is a kind of weird projectional capacity or intentionality of the system. So yeah, also big differences. Yeah, one has to be very precise what you mean with intrinsic, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope it answers, but we can extend it, yeah, if you like.
Well, thank you very much, Cyriel. That was just fantastic. I think for the sake of time, we might end up just closing proceedings there. But if anyone has any other questions, I'm sure you could reach out to Cyriel and he'd be willing to answer. Let me again thank you on behalf of everyone else. That was just fantastic and really lovely to hear kind of the perspective of where you came from in your scientific career, but also where you're still pushing towards really insightful questions and answers about the neural basis of consciousness. So thank you very much, Cyriel, and look forward to seeing you at different conferences.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. It's a great thing you do this podcast, and yeah,
great.
I'm sure it will be a great series. So yeah,
thanks,
I
mate.
hope to see you folks some other day. But yeah,
Thanks so much.
All right, take care. Enjoy your day. Bye bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.